Hi, Guy. Many thanks for joining me. Obviously, we hope to be in Worcester this week, where you are going to be playing the Herbert Howells Cello Concerto. Have you ever played at the Three Choirs Festival before?
I haven't, and I was really looking forward to this because my cousins live in Worcester, and I've spent quite a bit of time in Worcester and in the Malvern Hills just outside over the years. And yeah, it was a real shame that it didn't work out in the end.
Well, it's been 5 years now since you premiered the Howells Cello Concerto in Gloucester Cathedral, really Herbert Howells's spiritual home. Um, and that was a performance at the Cheltenham Festival. And you were to have played the three choirs performance this week. I just wondered, in those 5 years, obviously a lot of time's gone by from this new piece. I mean, I only finished the concerto in 2014. So how has your performance changed? How has it evolved, do you feel, during that time?
If we go right back to that first performance, it was with the Royal College of Music, and which of course is where Howells was teaching. And I remember playing it then and just being really kind of blown away by its kind of lyricism. And having sung a lot of Howells as a chorister at King's College in Cambridge, I couldn't believe that there was this sort of instrumental piece that I knew nothing about that you had helped to complete, and this sort of elegy to his young son who passed away, as we know, from polio. So a little bit like the Elgar Concerto, there's a feeling that it was written. There's a story behind it, and so it draws you in, and it's an incredibly beautiful piece. And I was just very grateful for the opportunity, and to have. I mean, the one sadness with the recording was that it was supposed to be with Stephen Cleobury conducting, and of course he fell ill around the time of the recording, and I was sad about that because our musical connection has gone back to when I was about 8 or 9 years old, and with my brothers even earlier than that. But I mean, it was wonderful to work with Christopher Seaman, and I had Stephen Cleobury very much in my thoughts during that recording, because it was sort of, it was a difficult time, and he was part of the reason how it came to being, and so yeah, for that I'm very grateful.
When I first started as a postdoc at Cambridge, Stephen was one of the first people I talked to in detail, and he was very proud of the score he has. He has a score of the Howells Partita for organ, which is signed from his time when he was at Westminster Abbey, and Howells signed a copy in the front, and he'd played it to Howells, and they'd had lots of discussions about its performance, and then it was quite amazing to have this copy and then to discuss his Stephen's own performance of it, which is on that CD. So we can. Sorry, it's not on that CD. No, he didn't record the partita in the end, but it was he records other organ pieces. But we were talking. Stephen and I were talking for quite a while about Howells and performance practice, and what evidence there is in the manuscripts and scores, and it was an ongoing discussion
Yeah.
about English music and how people think about this kind of music, and bridging this gap between the world of choral music and the world of orchestral music, and whether you should approach them in the same way. And certainly he was conducting orchestras, he was conducting choirs. It's kind of, should he be in the same frame of mind for those kind of things? So it was really interesting. But one of the things that I think he really forged with a lot of people in house performance was a very no nonsense approach. This wasn't English music to be luxuriated in. He was very no nonsense. It was kind of, it had to have a driving rhythm about it. It had to have energy, and I think you can tell that in his performances and the way he trained musicians. Can you remember singing any Howells with him as a conductor?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, all my formative years of musical training and singing in the choir, going on tours, and going into King's, you get this feeling that takes you back to your kind of your roots, your spiritual roots and your musical roots. So that always stays with me. I feel like I need that at least once a year to walk in that building to be reminded of that.
Howells himself had a postcard of King's Chapel, which he kept by his composing piano. So it's
Yes.
really always with him, that building and the presence, and yeah. I was just wondering about whether you go back to recordings and listen to yourself playing, because a lot of people can't stand that process. Have you listened back to the concerto at all?
Yeah, I did when it first came out. I listened to it, but then I generally, as a rule, put it away. I just feel that because often you hear something, and when you hear something again, it's a bit like a repeat in Bach or something. You want it to sound different. But I mean, I think it's interesting. The Britten Sinfonia hadn't even seen the music, and was so quick with as usual. Budgets are tight, and there had been a hope that we'd perform it together before the recording, but we just had to do what we could in that moment. And in that sense, it sort of felt like we were discovering the piece of music for the first time, still relatively unknown. And I think Christopher Seaman was really taken by it as well. And I, yeah, I mean, when I first heard the beginning, I couldn't help thinking Vaughan Williams. Here's the lark ascending all over again. It kind of similar sort of atmosphere to it somehow at the beginning. And then, as we know, there are these sections, aren't there? It's a really large-scale movement, that first movement. I mean, it was for his Oxford dissertation. I think he spent a lot of time on it, and so the form, the structure is really very clear. Kind of each section seems to build, and then it starts again, and then there's another kind of wave. And particularly as it gets to the end and the excitement of the sort of coda or the last pages, it's just somehow getting the pacing right, because he's building all the time, as you were saying, this sort of drive and so on. So that I found that was one of the big challenges of playing the first movement, this sort of overall shape of it. And of course, he really explores the whole range of the cello, and it was obviously a very personal work, as I said earlier, about his son passing away from polio at a ridiculously young age. And I think as a result, he kept coming back to it, didn't he? He was struggling to complete it, because it's sort of like something that obviously he needed to come back to, but could never quite complete somehow.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I was going to ask you about how you felt about playing a completed work like that, because since doing that, I've been working on a ballet score by Rubbra that he didn't finish, and another concerto by Rutland Boughton that he didn't finish. And these are both instances where the families came to me saying, "Oh, well, you've done this with the Howells. Are you interested in in something else?" And I kind of get the green light from people like that saying, "Please do it." But there's definitely a kind of big moral question here, and I just wondered how you felt about that kind of compositional process, and coming to it as a performer.
No, I think that look that it reminds me actually of the piece that I also played called Dark Pastoral by David Matthews, and of course it was written by Vaughan Williams, the outer sections, and he completed the inner section. You might know it, but he was writing for Casals, I think, and it was supposed to be a cello concerto, and eventually I think the estate allowed it to go out and to be orchestrated and completed. And I think it's similar to what you've been doing with the House, and as you say, the other pieces that you're working on. I think it would be a shame if we didn't hear all this music, and even if some of it is what we can only imagine it might have been, or it was a seed of something that needed to continue, and life needed to be, it needed to be brought to life somehow. And it would be interesting to see if what their thoughts would have been if only we could, but it would, or what it could have been. But I think that how you've managed to develop the last movement into out of these scraps of sketches. I mean, it's extraordinary that you were able to kind of bring it together into some. It's a sort of, it's funny. I think at one point you said there's some angry music in it, but it's also got a lot of lightness, hasn't it?
Yeah, I agree, and I think actually, it's interesting that his two big heroes at this particular point are Vaughan Williams, for whom he became a sort of spokesman, because he wrote about the Pastoral Symphony, and there's a kind of published analysis of it that was quite important in terms of people getting to understand Vaughan Williams's music. In a way, it was through Howells's commentary. And then Howells also did radio broadcasts on the Fourth Symphony of Vaughan Williams, which was seen as very modern, and people didn't really understand it totally. And so he had an important role there. And then in future, Howells actually sat in on the first playthroughs of a lot of the Vaughan Williams symphonies. So often had a say in giving Vaughan Williams feedback, which he then acted on. But Vaughan Williams was one hero, and the other was William Walton, because
Of course, yeah.
they knew each other from during the First World War, actually, when Walton was still at Christchurch, Oxford, and he would Howells would visit Walton, and we know that at certain points Walton was copying out some of Howells's scores, because at that point Howells was winning lots of competitions as a composer and was doing very well. So Walton was learning how to be a composer from Howells in some senses, and then we suddenly get this point in the 30s by which point Walton's incredibly famous because of pieces like Belshazzar's Feast and the Viola Concerto, and then in the middle of the 30s, the First Symphony comes
And the
out.
cello concerto.
So it's interesting that I think a lot more Walton goes into the final movement of the cello concerto, and that was the sort of those were the cues that I got from his sketches, and I sort of tried to run with that to get that kind of Walton sound in the orchestration. So there's a lot more brass than probably
And
people are
colour.
expecting, and colour and
Yes,
rhythmic
yeah.
energy. Because as you say, we've got these huge long lines in the first movement of the cello concerto, but then when we get to the third movement, all the lines are really short, completely the opposite. So
It's interesting that Walton, his first symphony, he also had a hard time finishing that symphony. All these. I think in that case, it was because I think people kept putting off doing their first symphony because what do you do after Beethoven and all these great guys that came before? And I think from what I remember, he was really struggling with. Although I think the first movement in that symphony is just unbelievable. It just grabs you right from the start. But isn't it interesting that composers can start with a really strong idea, and it's hard to see that through all the way to the end. He obviously put a tremendous amount into the first movement and was getting close to completing the second. So I find that quite interesting. I suppose there's all sorts of distractions and other things that come in, and maybe other commissions that were gathering momentum. It's hard, isn't it, to everything on course, and as a composer, if your mind is going off into other spheres, and with the choral music and all the other things that were going on, the organ music, and the posts and all the other organizing that goes on, you can imagine how hard it is to keep a thread of an idea going unless you're really cut off and totally invested in one thing.
absolutely, and I mean, certainly during this lockdown period, I've been at home with my young son, who's now 10 months. So I'm in total awe of anybody who continues their career with two young children. I'm starting to understand exactly what family life can be like if you're trying to
Amazing.
juggle all of these other musical things. And then
Yeah.
of course, the Second World War came along for Howells, and he went off in a really very different direction. So I think, and yes, you're right. I mean, I think Howells returned to the church after Michael's death, because he used to go to Twigworth, the church where Michael's buried, every single weekend, and he became their kind of unofficial organist. So it was very much the church was a safe space for him. And when he took up the position of acting director of music at St John's, Cambridge in the Second World War, he then had more connection with the church and choral music. So I think all of these things encouraged him to return to his roots, his Gloucester and his Salisbury roots, and write more for the church. And of course, success breeds success. So once you've published one very popular setting, the Cole Reg setting, then lots of people come along and say, "Can you write something for us?" So I think that's what then took him down that path, with so many commissions and so many things that distracted him from the bigger pieces, which he very rarely found time to do. But one of the great discoveries this year, I think, has been the Missa Sabronensis, which was written for Worcester Three Choirs in 1954, and David Hill has done a recording on Hyperion with the Bach Choir, and it's very, very exciting. But it's basically a choral symphony, and rather than a mass. I think the fact that it has the mass words is a kind of secondary feature. What he really wanted was this very large musical structure. So it's exciting that these two large-scale Howells works have come out in close succession, because I think they're really important to getting a sense of that. I wondered whether I could ask you about reviews, because actually I noticed that you had a string of 5-star reviews for your recording on the King's label of the Howells Cello Concerto, and one person said that Herbert Howells was the best kept secret in English classical music, which I thought was high praise indeed. Do you keep an eye on reviews? Do you read these kind of things? Are they important to you?
I mean, again, it's a bit like listening. You might catch a review, and your agents or the PR people send these things on to you, and you're terrified to read or think about it. It's nice to get a nice review, but it's not everything. I think being a part of all of that and then seeing the recording come into fruition, it was an idea that we presented to Stephen Cleobury and so on, and I think it was absolutely worthwhile, and it's a piece that hopefully will be programmed in the future. We need to get the BBC Proms onto it, and so on. But I think it's maybe now that I'm in America, we should, maybe they want to hear more. You said that there are a lot of American listeners that have been buying the recording, and that perhaps they enjoy listening to English music.
Yeah. Yes, I was going to ask you, because Matthew Shellhorn's just released a CD of Howell's piano music. They're all pieces that I've found over the last few years during my research, and we were very interested in looking at the analysis of the listening figures, because it's gone well over 200,000 listens now, and there's a huge chunk of that in America. And I was just wondering, yes, your thoughts on English music in America. Does it go down well? Have you been playing much? Do your students play much English music?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that next year, all being well, if we're allowed to play together again, if the Elgar Concerto is going to be the concerto competition piece for the students. So obviously that's a piece I've played many, many times. And a number of them want to play the Britten Suites and the Sonata and the Bridge, the Frank Bridge they love, and I've recorded a lot of those. So maybe they're aware of the recordings, but also I feel I can give them a lot because having studied the pieces quite a bit and had some experience with them. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting repertoire choices, but we tend, I think there's so much, which is quite difficult to know how to focus what repertoire is really worthwhile learning when you're a student, because it goes so quickly in those 4 years. And I think that quite often pieces that they learn, they're imagining their auditions coming up when they come out of college, like the Haydn D major concerto and Dvorak cello concerto first movement, and all the staple things, which is unfortunately also the same for a lot of promoters. They end up putting pieces that are familiar or well known, and I think part of our challenge is to try and provoke this a bit, and we're talking about this during a time, by the way, that there are no concerts, and there's nothing appearing online now, and some old recordings being dug out. But maybe once we're refreshed, hopefully, and recovered from this awful time, there could be a new status quo. There could be a new way of doing things, right? Way of running concerts, way of sharing music in the future, and it could bode well for contemporary music and lesser known works. And how many times can we listen to all these old great pieces of music, great concertos, great works? There's only so many times perhaps before we need to refresh our palates. So yeah, let's hope the Howells will get some more airings in the future.
This has been coming up a lot this year in my classes at the Royal Academy of Music, because we were discussing Beethoven quite a lot, partly because it's a big part of music history, but partly because of the Beethoven year, and discussing the signs from things like the the BBC Music Magazine poll. I don't know whether you saw this. They did a poll on Twitter about who was the greatest
Oh,
composer
yes.
of all time, and after a few weeks, the answer Clara Schumann came forth. I found it really interesting that um, that clearly audiences are demanding more variety. I think um,
Interesting.
because yes, I think Beethoven, people's love of Beethoven doesn't need to be proven, but whereas
Well,
I think people are demanding a larger variety and obviously a diversity of music. It's come at the same time as we're having big conversations on the because of the Black Lives Matter campaign, and obviously discussing things about other diversities, including obviously female composers and all this sort of representation. And I think
mm,
sometimes this English music does drop into this because it's all these repertoires that people don't know, and they bump into and say, "Well, actually, this is really enjoyable. Why haven't we heard this?" Dot dot
mm.
dot.
It's
So
interesting. It's so interesting hearing composers talk about each other's music as well. And I know that historically, composers generally don't get on very well, which is why it was quite interesting hearing you say how influenced Howells was and how respected by Walton and so on and so forth. They all respected each other, worked together. But I remember playing Taverner's Protecting Veil in King's College Chapel, and he came to the performance, and we were having a drink afterwards in the reception, and he said to me, "Yeah, I think I'm coming on to Beethoven."
I totally understand. I think Britain said similar things about Brahms. He just couldn't
Right.
stand it, which is
Yeah.
bizarre given
But if you,
how his chamber music seems to come out of that German tradition in certain aspects. For me,
and yet there's a feeling that they're trying to find their own voice, and you have to be quite sort of, I mean, Taverner's Soundworld is the completely other end of the spectrum to someone like, let's say, Beethoven. He has long lines that go on forever and slowly and serenely. And whereas Beethoven is testing us all the time and throwing things in that jar us and that sort of put us off kilter. And I mean, yeah, one could go on forever talking about these things, but I just find it interesting how, and from your perspective, of course, you are taking works and interpreting them and analyzing them and putting them into a structure. So the idea is there, and you're kind of weaving them together, which is a different kind of art, even to coming up with an idea and or a cell of an
yeah,
idea.
I mean, I see a lot of the stuff that I'm working on in a certain sense as new music because people haven't heard it before. They don't have any preconceptions, or they might do. They have some false preconceptions, like the Howells. They're assuming it's going to sound like Colreg, and I find that very exciting because it's all new. And so, yes,
Yes.
sort of like an archaeologist, but also sort of like a contemporary composer. I feel that I get that buzz from a premiere, which the composer couldn't have.
Well, we're very grateful to you for completing this. The cello concerto repertoire is limited. I mean, it's growing, but it's limited. I'm learning actually another new one by Gerald Barry, and I recently did one at the Proms with Charlotte Bray. So, you know, and that there are other commissions happening, and the cello seems to be coming into its own a little bit more than even the well. Rostropovich has got a lot to answer for.
Absolutely. I think we've got a lot to thank Rostropovich for. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me today, Guy, and talking about the Herbert Howells Cello Concerto. I hope people will go and listen to your recordings, and particularly the Howells Cello Concerto recording on the label of the Choir of King's, Cambridge. Good luck with everything, and we'll see you very soon.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you again for completing this glorious cello concerto. Let's hope for more performances.